You have a web application already. You've got authentication built in, and you're using Arcjet to provide bot protection and rate limiting for unauthenticated sessions. But you want to take it one step further. Perhaps you want to provide certain different levels of rate limiting to people in different departments of your organization, or you want administrators to be the only ones who have unrestricted access. In this video, we're going to look at implementing permission as a service system to define the rules that Arcjet follows depending on the permissions that the user has. Let's get straight into it. So let's have a quick look at an example app that we've already got running. There's a link in the description below to the GitHub repository where you can find this. We have a very simple system here that basically provides some stats information. You can tell at the top here we're logged out at the moment. We jump over into the stats page, we're going to get some fairly interesting statistics about the most popular toppings on pizzas, of course. Down at the bottom here, just for educational purposes, we've got a bit of information on what's coming back from the server. So we've got the raw JSON of the toppings, but we've also got information over here about the rate limiting that's been implemented. We can see that we have a rate limit that has a window of 60 seconds. We have a maximum of 5 requests in those 60 seconds. We have 3 of them remaining. So if I come back up to the top here and I click the refresh button a couple of times, we'll see that after a while, we're actually going to be rate limited. Access is now blocked. If I sign in as an existing user already, we will see that we now have no rate limit at the bottom. And if I click refresh up here a number of times, we're not actually going to get rate limited. It's going to keep providing the statistics to us as often as we want. Now, let's say that's not what you actually want for your internal users, for your employees or your colleagues, but you want to provide some kind of rate limiting, but a more generous level. So we're going to implement more generous levels of rate limiting for people who are logged in, but also we're going to look at a way of allowing certain users to have that unlimited access again. Let's say, for example, we've got a permission that allows people to update statistics. We'll want them to be able to refresh more often, or perhaps without a rate limit, in order to verify that the changes they're making are actually showing up. The first step I'm going to take is to jump over into Permit.io. So if you head to Permit.io and sign up for an account, I've got a blank project here. And in the policy tab over here, you can see we don't have any policies set up. I want to define a resource. So within permission systems, you have resources, roles, and permissions between them. I want to set up one resource, which is statistics or stats, so that we can then define roles and their permissions on those statistics. So I'll create a resource called stats, and I'm just going to leave the default actions here: read, create, update, and delete. So we'll save that. And then I'm going to come across to roles. You can see by default, we've got a viewer, an admin, and an editor. In this case, what we're going to say is that if a user has admin or editor role on statistics, then we're going to allow them to have unlimited rate limiting. Otherwise, if they're just a viewer, we're going to still rate limit them, but not as heavily as we would if they were a guest in the system. So let's jump back over to the policy editor here. And we can see we've got permissions set up here already. We've got our permissions on the left here. We've got our roles across the top. And at the moment, in terms of statistics, a viewer can read them, an editor can do everything except delete them, and an admin can delete. I think that's a fairly sensible default setup, so I'm going to leave it at that. Now what we need to do is jump into the code. We'll have a look at how the current system works and work out where we need to make changes in order to take these permissions into account. If we look at the code that's generating the statistics page at the moment, we can see that we have a call over here to fetch the stats from a backend. If we get a 429, which is rate limiting, or a 403, which is access denied, which we're using for bot detection, then we're going to set this variable of access blocked to true. And that's basically going to show us that access denied message. Otherwise, we're going to take the data and we're going to take the statistics out and the rate limiting information out. Remember the 2 boxes that we had at the bottom of the page? And we're going to put those into variables that we can then display further down below. So we don't actually need to make any changes to this page. Let's have a look at how the statistics are actually generated and returned. So that's in the API stats route file. And if we look at the top here, we're defining a get client function over here, which basically returns if the current user doesn't exist. In other words, if the user's not logged in, we're going to provide this maximum of 5 in a 60-second rate limiting, and we're also going to add bot protection. Otherwise, if the user is logged in, we're just going to return the Arcjet object. So then when we actually go into the route handler, we'll see that if we currently have a user, we're going to take that user ID. Otherwise, we're going to take the request IP address. And we're going to use that as the fingerprint of the current user. And then using that, we're going to get the client. Now, the client up here is also going to get the current user and use that to determine, as we just saw, what the Arcjet rules are going to be. And then based on that Arcjet object that we get back, we're going to call the protect function. We're going to pass in the request as usual. We're going to pass in that fingerprint that we defined, which is either the user ID or the IP address of the current user. And we're going to use that to then protect our application. And then down here, we've got our standard checks to see if it's rate limited. We return the 429. If there's still an error, it's not rate limited, then we return the 403 suspicious activity. Otherwise, and again, just for demonstration purposes, we output a bit of extra data for us to show in our response, the statistics and the rate limit data itself, and that gets sent back into our statistics page. So step one is to connect to permit. So I'm going to come in over here under library. I'm going to create a new file down here, and I'm going to call this permit.ts. Meanwhile, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to stop node, and I'm going to do an install of permit.io. And then in here, I'm going to import permit from permit.io, and we'll export a const call permit, new permit. So that's not correct. We want to bring in two variables. We want to bring in PDP, or a policy decision point. This is the service that's running that we're going to connect to ask whether or not a certain policy is in effect. Permit offer both a cloud-hosted and a self-hosted version of that. We're going to be using the cloud-hosted version, and we will set the value of that in our environments file. So that's going to be process.env.permit PDP. Let's just check that that's what I've called it. So an env.local, we've got the PDP, and we've also got our token. So we need to pull in token, which is permit.token. So on that, let's jump back in over here again. We need to set up the token, and that we get from the permit website. So let's jump over into settings, API keys. We're using the default project development down here. Reveal that key, copy this, we'll paste that in here. So that's done. And that's done. So we can close these two down. Now we're back in our API endpoint. So we're going to need to bring that in. So let's import permit from libpermit. And the things that we want to do, in here we've got the rule for if the user is not logged in, and then this is if the user is logged in. So let's, before we do that, decide whether or not the user has a certain permission. And if they have that permission, then we're going to give them one rate limit. If they don't have the permission, we'll give them a different rate limit. Check to see if the user has update permissions on stats resource. So in here, we're going to define a const of can update, which is going to await permit.check, which takes a user, an action, and a resource. So in our case, we've got a user. We want to actually use the ID as the identifier. And on the action, we want to check to see if they can update. And the resource is going to be stats. So we have a true false now. If the user can't update, then we want to define some extra rules on here. Actually, the proposed code here is a good start. So we want to add a sliding window, as we did for unauthenticated users up here, 5 per minute. We want to give these folks a little more. Let's give them 20 per minute instead. So we're going to have a max of 20 with an interval of 60. Because they're authenticated and they're internal staff, we're not going to do any bot detection on them. So now if they can't update stats, they get a 20 per minute rate limit. Otherwise, we still return that standard unrate limited rule set. So if we hit save on that and come back into our application over here, we do need to restart Node. We refresh this page, we will see that we now have a rate limit of 20 every 60 seconds. That's because we don't have permission to update stats. So let's have a look now in Permit, how we can set up that association between my user account and a user within Permit so that we can set the permission so that my user account can update the statistics. The way we're going to do that, if you remember in the code, we were checking on user ID. We're going to make the link on that user ID. So let's first of all come over into Clark. We can see my user account here. If we go in, we'll see here's the user ID. So I'm going to copy the user ID from my user account. And then I'm going to come over into Permit And under directory, I'm going to create a new user. So the unique ID of this, I'm going to use the unique ID from Clark. I'm going to put my email address in here. And at the bottom here, under assigned roles, I'm going to add the role of editor. Now, if you remember, editor and admin both had update, only admin had delete. So as an editor, I should have update permissions on statistics. If I hit save, and we go back to our application over here and I hit refresh, we will see, without having to do anything else, I'm now no longer being rate limited. So it's a real-time update because our application is querying permit in real time to determine whether or not I have update rights. Changes propagate immediately. So by default, new members still have that 20 per minute. Guests have the 5 per minute. And if somebody goes into permit and modifies the permissions and gives somebody update permissions on statistics resources, then they're going to be given no rate limit at all when they're refreshing this page. That's all I have for you for this time. Let us know in the comments how it's working for you. Jump onto our Discord channel and come and have a chat with us. And until next time, have fun.